Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar on Azure Landing Zones. We'll just give it another minute or so just for any people who want to join to log in and join, and then we'll get started. So we'll just have to listen to me for another minute or so, fill the gap, but obviously hope everyone's managing to stay cool today. I don't know what possessed me to do a webinar on the hottest day of the year, but I'll blame Megan for that one. But fortunately, it looks like it's cooling down this way a little bit. So we actually got some rain. So after this webinar's ended, I'm going to go and run around outside for a bit and cool off. That's my plan anyway. But okay, I think that's everyone logged in now. So we'll make a start. So first of all, a little bit of housekeeping. So on the agenda today, we're going to just go through some quick introductions. I'll then go through what a landing zone is, why they're needed. We'll have a little conversation around some of the design areas and guidelines, and then we'll look at implementation options with Q&A at the end. But please feel free to use the Q&A box to ask any questions you may have throughout the webinar. We've got Megan on the call as well, who's here to keep an eye on the question and answer box, and I'll happily stop in a relevant part through this presentation to answer any questions you may have. A little bit about Computer World as well. So for those of you who don't know who we are, we're a UK-based MSP based in Yate, just outside Bristol. We have been around for over 30 years now, and we hold many vendor accreditations, including 5 Microsoft Gold competencies, which is relevant for today's discussion. We also hold or access to a wide range of stock from our distribution network, and we also pride ourselves on our in-house architecture support and implementation teams. So a little bit more about what Computer World do. So we specialise in infrastructure modernisation, workspace transformation, security training and managed services. So our purpose is to enable people through technology. We're engaging in consultative in the way that we work, and we like to take the time to understand both the technical and the people side of the business to help our customers achieve their goals. And this is the last intro slide, I promise you. Who am I? So for those of you who don't know me, my name's Ben Evans. I'm now the director of the Azure practice at Computer World. I've worked at Computer World over 8 years, as you can probably tell from the photo. It's a little bit out of date. It's pre-kids, so I look very young and fresh-faced. I don't look like that now, as you can see. Outside of work, I've recently discovered my love of Lego again, as you can see by the collection of models I've got behind us. And I do like to do the odd certification or two around the Microsoft space. Previous roles in Computer World, I've joined Computer World as a pre-sales architect, and then more recently moved into managing that team and finally transitioning into the role I am today earlier this year. Okay, so let's get started with today's content. I always recommend when we discuss Azure, always start with the cloud adoption framework. This is the best place really to understand what it is you're trying to do, what you're trying to achieve. So for those of you who don't know what it is, it's a collection of best practice and guidance gathered through real world deployments from a wide base of customers and engineers. So it's created to help customers on their adoption journey, because when we're adopting cloud, there's so many different options and choices, and every business and organization will be different. They've got different needs, different requirements, but the process is always going to be the same. So this is to help you with that guidance and best practice to allow you to tailor your journey for your organization. And the key part of this is there's 6 stages for it. Today's webinar, we're really going to be focusing on the ready stage. This is where landing zones fall into the cloud adoption framework. But we do have done other webinars and workshops in the past focused around strategy and planning. So you can check in with those later on our social media channels. Okay, so what are landing zones? How do they help? So a landing zone really supports all paths to the cloud. So this can be migration of existing workloads on-prem to the cloud, as well as building out those net new cloud native applications. So it helps you set up your Azure environment around scale, security, governance, networking, and identity. So there's some key topics there which we'll dive into a little bit further. But they consider absolutely everything in the Azure portfolio. It's not just based around virtual machine requirements or things like that. There's no differentiation between the different services. It's an all-encompassing set of standard policies to help you adopt cloud. So the purpose of them is to offer repeatable packaged environments. When you're deploying your applications or workloads, everything's done in the same way, to the same standards, to the same process, to simplify that journey. So to move forward into the next area, I would just take a step back first and give this little visualization about what it is we're trying to build. So if we think about non-Azure for the purpose of this, if we're going to be building something, say a house, a stadium, a bridge, each one of those is going to have different requirements and different needs, different challenges. So when we start building these type of structures, we're always going to start with the foundation. So which one's the right one for you? So not every foundation is created equally. So each one's going to have a different starting point. So the foundations for a house will be different to a stadium, to a bridge. They all serve different purposes. But really the key thing to take away from this is when you move into the cloud, always starting with that right foundation is really key, really fundamental to what it is you're trying to do. And this is where landing zones can help. So what are they for? So this is to start you on your Azure journey. So before even deploying your first workload, you should be considering a landing zone, which is a set of best practices from the start to finish to allow you to be successful with cloud migration. So I'm just going to take a sip. It's extremely hot. My mouth's starting to dry up. So as I mentioned to you earlier, it's consistent, repeatable designs that helps you scale your environment and make sure you've got the right governance and security packaged around the solution you're deploying. It also considers things like technical training and enablement across your teams. So moving to a cloud model, it may involve different tooling, different processes, different way of doing things. So let's have a little look at some of the design areas that we need to consider when planning and implementing landing zones. So as alluded to earlier, based on the cloud adoption framework, there's 8 key areas that we talk about with designs. So remember the foundation that we're building here and how it depends on what it is we're building. So every one will have a common set of attributes. And these set of attributes have been identified as the most common ones across every organization's requirements and goals. So some of them are based around environmental considerations. So how we are configuring our environment around identity, billing, organizing our resource, how we're connecting our networks. And the important ones, and sometimes the ones that I've forgotten about, are the compliance ones. So security, is our environment secure? Is it governed correctly? How are we going to manage it? And looking ahead to how we're going to automate things with a DevOps mindset. So moving into some of the design areas that we talk about most commonly with our customers. So the first one is identity. So most of you out there can have an identity in Azure already. This has typically come from adoption of Microsoft 365 services such as Exchange Online, SharePoint, Teams, OneDrive. We'd have typically extended our Active Directory on-prem into Azure using Azure AD Connect, synchronizing our identities. But it's also important to consider our apps that we're using in the future. What sort of compatibility have they got? Will they work natively with Azure AD? Or do we still need a domain controller and Active Directory domain services? So do we need to host our domain controllers in the cloud? So it's important considerations about how we're going to use that identity piece. Another area to look at is licensing. So do we need additional licensing? So Azure AD Premium P2 unlocks some of the more advanced features, giving you some benefits around privileged identity manager and access reviews to understand who has privileged access to our environment and when they can use it. Another area to look at is role-based access control. So this is really key. So I've seen many environments out there where the global administrator account is being used, we say inappropriately. It's a very highly privileged account that really shouldn't be held by any more than 5 users in the organization. The best way around that is to use the RBAC roles that are built into Azure AD or Azure. They can be anything from like the owner, reader, contributor roles, or if the roles don't exist, there's a lot of granular level roles. You can even create your own if you've got the right licensing. Always be thinking about the principle of least privilege for this. So giving the users just enough privilege to the resource they need to control and no more. And it's about laying down that right framework when we're designing our landing zone to ensure this can be consistently deployed and managed. Managed identities is something different in Azure. So this is a way of allowing a resource to authenticate without the need to manage credentials. So it's far more secure than storing secrets and passwords. We can use managed identity on resources so they can authenticate themselves seamlessly. So I alluded to just a moment ago, Privileged Identity Manager will help control when people can elevate their privileges. So it does need to be enabled all the time. They only need to perhaps have that global administrator role when they need to perform a certain activity, and outside that time, that role's not available to them. We can also bake in MFA and conditional access to it. So we can only log on to the portal with a managed device, or we want to have some other restrictions around there based on multi-factor authentication. And just-in-time access is also a very good feature to use, and that comes with AD Premium P2 in Azure Defender for Clouds, is allowing that just-in-time access to virtual machines and resources. So what we mean by that is we only open up the management ports when needed. We can do the piece of work that we need to do, and then we can close it off again. And not only that, we've got full audit trails from who's done what, when, why they were doing it, so it can be audited. Moving on to the management. So managing Azure is going to be slightly different than on-premises. So there's going to be different tooling available around monitoring and alerting. So the processes we've got in place at the moment to manage our on-prem workloads may need to be changed as we move workloads into the cloud. So it's important to understand which teams will need to receive things like alert notifications, or do we have an existing service management tool that we need to integrate into? And Azure provides many built-in services, as you would imagine, around Azure Monitor to monitor our resources in Azure, provide that logs and metrics and things like that. We can store those logs in a log analytics workspace for a defined period of time. If we've got governance requirements, we can archive those up for many years. Things like dashboards, another great example to give us that visibility into the workloads, how they're performing, what metrics we need to monitor, and what's important to the organization in terms of being successful and running a successful cloud operation. So which services are considered business critical and require high priorities? That's going to be something you need to define as well. So not all workloads are equal. We'll have test and dev, for example, which may not need as stringent SLAs as our production workloads, for example. And the power of Azure means we can use things like automation to manage configuration drift, update management, and inventory management. Not forgetting things like backup and DR. So what I mean by that is a lot of customers will have a very defined on-prem backup strategy, which includes DR, which is typically linked to a site or physical office location. When we move the workload to a cloud such as Azure, it's still important to consider how we're backing up those workloads, what's our SLAs we need to meet on our RPOs and RTOs, for example. We also need to consider things like application availability. So do we need to use things like availability zones or multi-region deployment? What's the level of uptime that application needs? And that can go down to granular things such as the type of storage we need, whether that's locally redundant or zone redundant. So there's many different considerations we need to use, to review when we're choosing which resources to use for Azure. And finally, when it comes to things like management, VMs, please don't use public IP addresses on virtual machines. There's far better, more secure ways. Azure Bastion is a service that offers a secure way to remotely manage the virtual machines using RDP and SSH without opening up public IP. Okay, moving on to governance. So when we're moving into the structure, how we structure our Azure resources, we've got a defined hierarchy that we can use, and that's starting with management groups, going into subscriptions, then into resource groups, and then finally resources. So the purpose of doing that is allow us to apply things like policy and map our organizational requirements at a high level. So starting at the management group at the top, we also have a tenant root group, and then we can create up to 6 management groups down, and we can apply policies and things like that at this layer that are then inherited by all the subscriptions and resources underneath. We can then move into a subscription organization. These are a unit of management and also a billing boundary, and there are also things to consider such as scale. So a subscription can only hold so many resources of a certain type. So maybe in large organizations you want to break that out into several subscriptions. Then we move into resource groups. So resource groups are typically used for a workload that share a common function or life cycle or common access requirements. So going back to things like resource access control, I've got a common set of applications down here that a particular user needs. You can create a role-based access control policy here at the resource group level, and that's inherited by all the virtual machines. We've got that standard approach. So moving on to Azure policy, these are the guardrails of your cloud environment. So this effectively controls what we can and can't do in Azure. So it's really important to review the policies and understand what are the best ones for your environment. So an example of this could be what locations you can use. So everyone here may be based in the UK, for example. I only want to deploy resources to either UK South or UK West. You can create a policy in there that only allows you to do that. If you try and do it outside of that, it will fail the deployment. Another example could be allowing VM SKUs. So there's hundreds of different virtual machine SKUs, anything ranging from a couple of dollars a month up to something like tens of thousands of dollars a month. So you can limit which SKUs you can deploy. So no one can make a mistake and deploy a really expensive SKU and then you get a big bill at the end of the month. And policies can be used in enforce or audit mode as well. So you don't have to have policies enforcing things. You can use them just to audit your environment. You just want to make sure you're following best practices, recommended practices, highlighting any consistency. You can do that through Azure policy. The final one really on that is you can actually use automation to use a deploy if not exist policy. So what I mean by that is, say, for example, you can deploy a virtual machine that must have an agent or extension installed on that virtual machine. You can automate that function using Azure policy. So if that virtual machine is deployed and it doesn't have that agent installed, the policy will detect that and automatically remediate that to an automation account to make sure it's got that extension installed. Another example could be enrolling it into backup or Azure Site Recovery Manager automatically to make sure that the workload is protected. Resource locks are a good one. So these prevent changes to the environment, either accidental or malicious. So these can make your environment either read-only, so the resource group read-only, or you can't delete resources in there. So it's that extra layer of security to prevent people making mistakes. Or if you need to go one step further, you can use blueprints to package up all of this into a policy assignment that you can then push down. So that can handle everything like ARM template deployment, policy assignment, role assignments, all in one go. And you can deploy that at the management subscription group level. A few more areas in governance around naming standards. So when we're naming resources in Azure, it's recommended to have that consistent naming approach. So use a standard that's scalable for resources that may span globally eventually. Tagging is another good one. So have a defined tagging strategy. Typical examples of this could be cost center and chargeback, or application owner is the workload production or dev test. Others could be department or business unit that own that application. So, the world's your oyster with tagging. It will support multiple tags. So you can come up with a scheme that best suits your organizational needs. And the final one on governance is really around Azure cost management. So it's important to be using the tools built in, such as Azure Advisor, to check optimization recommendations. And this will make recommendations on resizing VM SKUs or where to apply reserved instances. But it's also important to make sure you're setting budgets and alerting to inform you of that cloud spend you're having, so you don't get a bill shock at the end of the month once you've consumed resources. And there's ways of saving costs around shutdown and automation. So anything you paid for in Azure, you pay for as it runs. If you're not using that resource, then turn it off, shut it down, and you don't pay for the compute element of it. So it's a really good way to optimize those workloads. So security. Microsoft have got their zero trust principles, which is based around three things, which is verify explicitly, so always authenticate and authorize based on your available data points. So regardless of what the user is, what they're doing it from, you should always be authenticating those users at the appropriate time. Use least privileged access. So I've touched on this before in previous slides, is limit that user access with just in time, just enough access to do what they need to do. And this just helps reduce that risk element from a security perspective. And assume breach. So always assume that everything's compromised in the cloud. And this really is about minimizing the blast radius and segment that access. So before, when we're on an on-premises environment, we talked about the egg with that very secure hardened shell on the outside. It's very difficult to do that with cloud services. Workloads are everywhere. Identities, people are everywhere these days. So it's all about the identity being the new security boundary. So we need to make sure that we've got things like encryption and rules protecting the workloads that don't need to talk to one another. So if anything is breached, the damage of that is minimized. And Microsoft have got a whole host of tools available to us here. As you can see, I'll go through some of these, but these obviously do have a cost. So it's about understanding the benefit versus that risk in your organization. And Microsoft do spend billions on cybersecurity and security in general every year. So starting with Key Vault, this is where we store certificates, secrets and keys. So anything that's got any important secure information, we should be putting that into a Key Vault. And securing access to that through managed identities and user access control. Microsoft Defender for Cloud is another one. So there are two tiers for this. There's a free tier and the standard tier. So the free tier, obviously providing basic support and basic functionality in terms of recommendations and secure score. If you go up a level to the paid tier, you get access to Azure Defender for Endpoint, get vulnerability assessments, threat protections, compliance, and a lot more. So it's a worthwhile service. And there's more advanced security services around Sentinel, which is Microsoft Cloud Native SIEM source solution. The dynamic denial of service offering as well, which is the enhanced standard plan, which gives you a greater level of protection. Things such as Azure Firewall, how do I need to be protecting my workloads? If you're moving from on-prem, you're likely to have a perimeter firewall. Once you move workloads to the public cloud, do we still need that similar level of functionality in terms of the firewall? Includes Microsoft's Cloud Native stateful firewall. There's north-south traffic, east-west as well, and operates from layer 3 to layer 7. And more importantly, the threat intelligence being fed into this firewall comes directly from Microsoft Security Center. So all the analytics across their environments all fed into that Microsoft Security Center, so you get real-time notifications and up-to-date information. The web application firewall, or WAF, this is really used to protect layer 7 workloads. So these are applications that have got a web front end, and it protects against common hacking techniques such as SQL injections and vulnerabilities such as cross-site scripting and those type of things. I've already mentioned Privileged Identity Manager. The final one being Network Watcher, which is a way of gaining insight into your network patterns using flow logs to inspecting that traffic flowing in your Azure environment, and you can run things like packet capture for network monitoring as well. So there's quite a few tools that are built in. They're not all turned on by default, and they've all got a cost associated with them. So part of the landing zone deployment and design process is understanding which ones you need, which ones will add value to your organization, balancing against that cost and risk that you have. Finally, things like vulnerability manager, vulnerability management, should I say? So patching the virtual machines. So you may have an on-prem solution to do that. Moving to the cloud, is there a different way of doing it? Will that all work? But you still need to patch IaaS workloads. There's still your responsibility to provide that OS security layer and the application security layer in there. Once you start moving to PaaS services and things like that, so Microsoft will take some of that responsibility away. And encryption as well. What type of things need to be encrypted and using what method? So this could be at-rest encryption, in transit encryption, where you're going to store your security keys. You've obviously for that. And you can use Azure Policy to enforce or audit on these requirements to make sure that they are being met. So the next area is network connectivity. Most customers start with the on-premise network connectivity requirements. So we're going to start off by moving some workloads to Azure, which typically requires some sort of VPN connectivity back to your site. How we're going to configure that, make sure that the address and routing and everything's going to be taken care of. There's a second way of doing connectivity to on-prem, and that's with ExpressRoute. So this is typically required where latency is lower latency is needed. The applications can't tolerate the high latency that you get over VPN, or if you've got really high bandwidth requirements, and it's not possible to put that bandwidth through a VPN, you would go down the ExpressRoute. But obviously, there's a cost associated with that. So it's about designing how your connectivity is going to work. You need to plan out your IP address space. So an IP address space is tied to a VNet, and a VNet is tied to a subscription region. So you need to make sure that you're designing your VNets so they're scalable. So planning ahead for growth is really important, and they can't overlap with existing IP address ranges. So the design aspect of your network is really, really important. And when it comes to the design, there's typically a few options. Most of the ones we see are hub spoke. So where this would be a set of core services in a hub environment with workload spokes connecting back into this. We may deploy a firewall in there to inspect the traffic between them. Or for larger organizations that have got a lot of remote sites, you can actually offload some of this work to Microsoft themselves and have a virtual WAN solution. And this is more of a managed connectivity solution that reduces some of the admin overhead of this. Other areas of network connectivity to consider is NSGs. So an NSG is a network security group. So this is applied at the VNet level. And this is similar to a firewall, it's just not as clever. It operates at layer 4, and the rules are based on the 5-tuple approach, so source port, destination port, protocol. The ASGs are used to group together common workloads. So, for example, here, if we've got a common group of applications, so on this diagram here, there's 3 servers with the same requirements, we can tag them with an ASG, and it just allows us then to apply policy at scale. So rather than tagging each individual virtual machine, we would just say all web servers need to have this rule, or AT open, whatever that may be, and you can tag those in that network security group to apply that. DNS is a really critical one, so understanding how your name resolution needs to work. So there's multiple different ways of doing DNS resolution in Azure. So there's Microsoft's own DNS services in there. You can use private DNS zones. Most organizations will need to have some connectivity back to the main controllers on-prem. So it's really important to understand and bring into the design how you're going to do your name resolution. Public facing services need to be considered as well. So anything's got a public IP address, so we need to change and how you can present that through to Azure. Or there need to be a load balancing solution placed in front of that, and what's the best solution for that. So there's multiple different load balancing options available to you with Azure. It's about understanding that right requirement. You know, is it going to be a global load balancing solution? So something like Azure Front Doors are going to be more regional based. You know, that could be the Azure Load Balancer, public load balancer, or the app gateway. So depending on your requirements, we'll determine the correct service for you to use for that. Almost at the end of this slide. So the final pieces really are routing. So understanding and planning how the routing needs to work in your environment. Do we need to route stuff back to on-prem for inspection, or do we need to route stuff on-prem to the cloud for inspection? And you can control that through user-defined routes and manually map where your traffic is going to go in your extended network. And finally, segmentation. So going back to the zero trust point I mentioned earlier around how we segment our network, it's important that we should be taking that zero trust approach. So applications that don't need to talk to each other shouldn't have anything open. Everything should be segmented and secured correctly in the network design. Okay. So I've covered a lot there. As you can see, there's quite a lot of things to consider. And fortunately, there's an easier way to get started with this. So Microsoft have put together solutions to help you with the implementation. So a lot of what I've discussed are the key points we do in workshops with you. So these workshops are held over many sessions discussing all of the in-depth requirements for you and your organization. Ultimately, there's 2 common approaches we've seen, which are the start small and expand. So this is maybe useful where you're going to just begin your Azure journey and you can only put a few workloads in there, maybe testing down something low risk, but you want to make sure that that can grow, and it may grow quickly. So it's really important to get that groundwork, those guardrails, the right governance in place from day one. So we can deploy a start small and expand landing zone for you to get you started. And this has got all the key components that we deem necessary to give you that secure environment. Other options are starting with enterprise scale. So large organizations will have more complicated needs. They're going to be multi-site, multi-region, multi-subscription. So there's a lot more that goes into the design aspect of this. But in both instances, Microsoft give you good guidance, and the documentation is brilliant on the Cloud Adoption Framework page. It goes into all the details of how to get started with this. So a little bit of a visual explanation here about what the landing zone consists of. So there's 2 here on the screen, the CAF Foundation, the CAF Migrate. So as you can see, we've got a very simple setup here. We've got our overarching identity security piece, the governance down here through the use of Azure AD Security Center and policy. We've got our subscription, so single subscription, and within there we'd have multiple resource groups hosting the resources that we need. We can store the logs and the secrets and key vault, and you can just grow this organically. Another one is typically commonly used with Azure Migrate, to have an Azure Migrate appliance in here as well to help migrate those workloads on-prem into here, but the same policy would apply. You just start with that small and govern, control landing zone to help you grow your environment organically. So moving on to enterprise scale. So this is where things get a little bit bigger. You may have more complex needs. So in this example here, we've got on the screen, we start to use management groups a little bit more. So there's multiple levels where we can apply Azure policy. So Azure policy applied here at this landing zones management group, but then be inherited by anything underneath it. So it allows us to scale in a repeatable, controlled way and governed and controlled at the right level. So in this instance, there's multiple subscriptions. Each subscription's got a purpose. For example, this has got applications in the web facing. We've got an application gateway in there to handle the inbound traffic. We've got some virtual machines here with a recovery vault. And then we've got a platform subscription here, which has got all of our connectivity and core services requirements, the things like hosting domain controllers. We've got our firewall, we've got Sentinel. So this will scale. And as we deploy application pods, we will just add an additional arm onto each of the landing zone aspects. And it comes back to that repeatable, consistent deployment that everyone we do will be the same conventions, the same standards, the same policy. So it's about getting that framework right up front to ease the journey we have moving forward. So one more example to run through is obviously the hub spoke deployment that I mentioned earlier. This is where you've got a lot more network connectivity requirements in here. For example, you split out the landing zones into connectivity subscriptions. So we've got express route circuits in here. This may be large organizations with VPN gateways, with our NVAs or firewall, all managed as one subscription. Then we've got our virtual machines with their own networks that will be peered. So peering is just a way of connecting two Azure networks together. You can go across subscriptions and go across regions. Okay. Some customers I talk to have already made a start and get started with Azure. They may have put workloads in there already. Typically, we like to experiment as IT folks, so we're happy to take on the responsibility of trying services. Sometimes those services then quickly can move into production, or we rely on them. That doesn't matter with the landing zones. So we can do brownfield deployments, and this is where we retrofit almost a landing zone to cover off the basics for workloads that are already there. So you may be thinking, oh, I've already migrated some stuff. How do I get around this? It is possible to retrofit, like I say, the landing zones and the policies afterwards, and move resources across. So the way we would do that is most of the time, POC to production happens without a meaning to happen. So when we're doing a pilot for a workload, we just want to make sure that will the workload run in Azure as I anticipated would? Will it perform correctly in Azure? Is it cost effective to run it in Azure? So we're thinking around the application needs and the application requirements rather than the security of Azure. So typically we just get the application running in Azure to see if that works. What we forget about is all the things we've discussed in this webinar around security and compliance and governance. So retrofitting that is recommended we do to make sure that when it does go into production, it's got all the guardrails and meets all your compliance needs and reduces the risk for your environment after you put that workload in there. So the benefit of the cloud, you can fail fast, you can experiment, you can prove theories, but having a landing zone just allows you to have that security wrap around it to make sure that you're doing things in a controlled way. How we realign things into a landing zone is typically moving workloads into subscriptions. So maybe we deploy a new subscription in there, migrate the workloads across. We can change the management group structure, so it will support scale in the future, and then readdress the Microsoft networking requirements, move those into dedicated subscriptions if need be. But the important thing to take away from this is it is possible to do things after you've landed a workload in Azure, to go back and revisit those requirements. Okay, approaching the end now, which is good because I am extremely hot at the moment. As you can probably tell, my face has gone a very red colour. It's being 33 degrees in there now. Anyway, back to the slide. So the value in creating cloud-ready environments. So what is the purpose of doing this? So we need to allow organizations to deliver business priorities using Azure, but that environment does need to be secure. The operating model that runs the application does need a good foundation to run on top of. And we need to make sure that it can scale and be robust. So the purpose of the cloud-ready environment using landing zones is that we can be in a position to deploy all of this using code. This is repeatable, this is processed, so it allows the organization to become adaptable and agile, but in a secure way. So it allows everyone to innovate and grow and expand as the organisation is requiring us to do, but in that controlled way, without forgetting security, without forgetting compliance and all the policies that we need to consider, the same things we would consider on-prem that taken for granted sometimes. We need to have that same thought process when it comes to cloud. And that is the end of the presentation on landing zones. So it's time, if anyone's got any questions, please feel free to ask any questions.
Haven't got any as of yet, Ben.
Okay, that's fine. If you do have any questions, feel free to get in contact with me afterwards. My email address is ben.e@computerworld.co.uk. I'm happy to answer them or have a chat with you offline. Other than that, next steps. So if you want to chat to me or anyone in the team around Azure, landing zones, migration projects, anything like that, please book a cloud strategy session. And I just realised there's a QR code here, but not a link. So Megan, I don't know if you could pop the link for this into the chat. But if not, we can send it out afterwards. Let me see if I can do that here actually. Okay.
I got it.
Got it. So.
Done.
Fantastic. So yeah, please click that link, and there's a link to a Microsoft form. Fill out your details in there, and we'll be in touch to book in a strategy session with you. With that said, that's the end of the presentation. If no one has any questions, I would like to thank you very much for your time this afternoon and attending the webinar. And I'm going to go and dance in the rain now and cool off a bit and try and get my face back to a normal colour. So thank you everyone for joining. I hope it was useful.